Hi, I'm a journalist, and for some reason, over the past few years, I found myself reporting from the world's hotspots. So I've spent time in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Iran, all the countries, just mention it. Sometimes I think there was something wrong with my childhood. Maybe I ate the wrong vegetables or something growing up. So what is journalism? It's telling stories. And I'd like to use the next few minutes to tell you a few of the stories that have impacted my life. When Amina asked me to talk, I was thinking, well, which stories should I share with you? Should I share with you the story of 18-year-old Miriam, a Palestinian girl who lives in Gaza, who I met when she was in bed in Al-Shifa Hospital in Gaza City. She was sobbing uncontrollably, and the Israeli-Gaza conflict was in full swing, and she had lost her left leg. She told me her dream was to be a school teacher and get married and have kids. And now, without a leg, she told me that her only hope was to be the wife, the second wife, of an old man. You can step across the border, and I can introduce you to Yossi, who is an Israeli father, who every morning goes to visit the grave of his son, David. The grave is in the shape of a surfboard because David loved surfing. And it was his dream that after he finished the army, he would travel the world and surf all the major oceans. But David was on the number 13 bus one Thursday afternoon, and he was talking to his father, Yossi, and his father heard the bomb explode and his son on the other end of the phone. And so what Yossi did was he designed the grave in the shape of a surfboard, and he put online a picture of his son David. And it went around the world, and people around the world sent that picture back to him. So there's a picture of somebody holding this photo of David on the top of Mount Kilimanjaro, and another picture of someone holding this photo at the bottom of the Dead Sea. And as the father told me, my son, who was 13 when he died, never got the chance to travel the world, but in this way, the world came to him. If any of you are planning a dinner party, I'm the person you want to invite. We, as journalists, can talk about absolutely any topic for 2 minutes. Don't ask us anything else after that. I was looking online what they think about journalists, and did you know that the least trustworthy people in the world are second-hand car dealers? And then straight after them come journalists. So actually, don't believe a word I'm sharing with you today. How did I get into journalism? Why did I get into journalism? It was about telling stories, because stories have the power to change people's minds. Stories have the power to transform our world. And I go to war zones, which might sound strange, but if I tell you what brings about a war is the worst in humankind, and when I'm in a war zone, what happens? You see the best of humankind. It is an honor for me to go to conflict zones and to share people's homes and people's hearts. So many people, when they've just lost a family member, they've lost their home, they'll share their last piece of bread with me. And for that, I am eternally humbled. I also think it's because in one day, if I have grandchildren, which is going to be a bit difficult because I haven't had children yet, but if I was to have grandchildren, I would be able to tell them, I was there at the moments in history when big events were happening. And that might sound a bit selfish, but what an amazing career to have, where you can identify the big stories of your life and be there on the front line to tell those stories. So for me, it really, really is an honor. People say to me, I'm brave. I'm not brave. I go as a journalist to Afghanistan. I go for a week, 2 weeks, and I come home. The real brave people are the people who don't come home, are the people who have nowhere else to go. Now, we've all been following the story of Afghanistan and this mad rush to try and get people out of Afghanistan who helped the Brits, who helped the French, who helped the foreign forces. I don't know if you really appreciate how important those people are to us as journalists. I'll share a story with you. I was in Libya when Gaddafi was still in power. and he put all the foreign journalists in one hotel. So, heaven forbid, if the NATO forces had bombed that hotel, all of us would have been killed in one go. But it was his way of controlling the media. And he would not let us out of that hotel. Now, a CNN colleague of mine decided he was going to escape from our hotel, and he took his cameraman and his producer, and he walked outside the hotel and he just raised his hand and he flagged down a taxi. Ordinary taxi, driving past, simple man, just saw 3 men on the side of the road and gave them a lift. He gave them a lift to Green Market Square, which is the main square in Tripoli in Libya. They started filming there, and while they were filming, Gaddafi's henchmen arrived and arrested everybody, including the taxi driver. Sometimes I think because I'm a foreign journalist, I have a little bit more security. What happened to this team is the three journalists, the cameraman, and the producer, were brought back to the Rixos Hotel where we all were. And the CNN correspondent told me that the last thing he saw was the military van driving away with the terrified face of the taxi driver staring at him through the window. We have a responsibility to these people who help us in foreign countries that we don't abandon them. And that's why it's so important that these Afghan producers, families, translators are brought out of Afghanistan as soon as possible. What is happening in Afghanistan today is not a surprise. I've been there several times, and I can give you a few examples. I was embedded with the American Army, and I think they were a bit surprised. They heard that I work for Russian television, and I'll talk about that in a moment, but I'm actually South African. And I think they were expecting these 3 Russians to arrive, and here they get stuck with a South African girl who speaks actually English. They were worried how they were going to talk to us. So we're with the American soldiers, and they would go on patrol. And the locals would tell us, when the soldiers were not there, that they would always know in advance when the Americans were coming, and they would let the local population know. And many had relatives and family who were part of the Taliban. So they would go into hiding, and when the American soldiers would come into a village, there'd be no Taliban. They would then leave, and the Taliban would resurface. So not a big surprise that the Taliban have survived all these years. The amount of money that was spent in Afghanistan, and we're back at square one. An NGO, a non-governmental organization, at one stage there were 6,000 NGOs in Afghanistan, and 40% of their budgets would go to security. Now, what was the security? The security was 120 private security firms, so firms from America or Europe or wherever, also South Africa. They would use their budget, so that's the money that people are giving to help build Afghanistan. They would use 40% for security. These private firms would protect their convoys, but some areas in Afghanistan were so dangerous and were controlled by the Taliban that the security firms would actually pay the Taliban not to attack these convoys. You tell me if any of this really makes sense. I have to share with you one funny story. So I'm in Afghanistan and we're on a patrol. I have my helmet on, I have my bulletproof vest, but I also had my red nail polish. And we're walking through a school. And it's a small village, and we got to the school and we took a break. So I took off my helmet and I watched this group of kids that had been following us. And the one looked at me, and in those days I had longer hair, and he must have noticed the red nail polish, so I could see that he was a bit aghast that this was a woman. And he came up to me and he said, "Ma'am, does your husband know you've left the house?" If you had to ask me what it's like to be a woman journalist in the parts of the world that I go to, Afghanistan sums it up the best for me. It's like not being male, and it's not being female. It's something in between. They actually don't know what we are. It's like you have men and women and female foreign journalists. It has its advantages. So, for example, we would go and interview the mujahideen, and I'd go to their homes. And I'd get to sit with the men in the lounge, and we would all have a meal. And then I'd have to leave my cameraman behind, and I was allowed to go into the kitchen, where the women and children are, and I can share their stories and talk to them. So that's the advantage. The disadvantage, it's pretty dangerous. Stories of rape, stories of sexual harassment. In 2011, it was the start of the Arab Spring, and I was reporting in Tahrir Square, which is in Egypt, Cairo. Reporters Without Borders sent out a memo to all international news agencies saying, do not send women reporters to Cairo, to Tahrir Square. Now you can imagine, as women reporters who've worked so hard to get to where we are, we were furious. But that's the concern, that it actually is more dangerous for women in these kind of environments than it is for men. The statistics are also quite depressing. Only 19% of experts who are quoted in the media are women. Only 37% of reporters in the world are women. And did you know that 71% of people who are harassed online are women? Now, I work closely with that from my own personal experience, and I belong to a working group of the OSCE. And there we look at ways that women bloggers and women journalists can protect themselves online. It's not just about protecting yourself in the field. I was reporting for Russian television in Ukraine, and a Ukrainian blogger, didn't like what I was saying and started a witch hunt in which he was quoted, in which he was saying things in tweets like, let's find this Russian, okay, I won't swear. I won't swear. Let's rip her head from her body. Let's skin her alive. The most horrendous things, to the point that my editors in Moscow pulled me out of the country. So when we talk about journalism today, it's not just physical dangers, but it's online dangers as well. So how did a South African land up working for a Russian TV channel? I asked myself the same question. It was supposed to be a job that was going to last 3 months until a real job came along, and now it's been 15 years. But I want to share something with you, and just something maybe that you could think about or understand what we're struggling with as journalists. The Russian channel I work for, RT, presents itself as the Russian point of view. So when I go to Ukraine and there's the Ukrainian-Russian war, I'm not saying I'm objective news. I'm saying I'm presenting a Russian perspective of this war. There were parts in Ukraine that I could go to because I was from the Russian media and the American media could not go to. And there were parts of Ukraine that I could not go to because I was Russian media, and people in that part of the country were supporting Kiev and the European and the Western media. So, firstly, I think that's part of the reason why it's become so dangerous for journalists, is that I'm seen as being a Russian journalist. I'm banned from going to Ukraine because I'm seen as a Putin information soldier, as a propagandist. But I pose to you that maybe one person's propaganda is another person's truth. And so what we as journalists are struggling with is, what is journalism today? I'm also based in Israel. And if I go to Syria to report on the conflict, it literally takes me 3 steps, if I could, to walk across the border from Israel to Syria. But because the countries are at war, I have to take a plane and go through a third country, and it takes me 24 hours to land up back where I was. Also, as journalists, it's become so dangerous that we can't go to war zones anymore by ourselves. We have to do, you know the term embedding. We have to join an army. So I was part of the American army in Afghanistan. I was part of the Syrian army in Syria. And there I remember one of the commanders, when we left, and he stayed behind, giving me a mirror, and the mirror had a cross on it. And he said to us, most of us are not going to make it out of here alive. Please pray for us. Islamic State, when they were taking over huge areas of Iraq and Syria, it was too dangerous for us as journalists to go and report from there. So how did we tell the story? We used the video that they gave us. And then I asked you the question, are we not doing their work for them? Do you remember those videos where they caught journalists and they chopped off their heads? As a journalist, these were the questions we in newsrooms around the world were asking ourselves. Do we show those videos or don't we? If we don't, you can see it on social media. If we don't, we have a responsibility to do it because it is news. But if we show it, what do you show? Do you show the whole story, or do you stop at the moment that the knife comes to the head? Do you stop after the person's died? Are you encouraging copycats like that around the world? My career is changing. I think the future of journalism is going to be fake news, is going to be dealing with facts that are incorrect, and also dealing with a whole range of TV stations, like Russia Today, like Al Jazeera, like CCTV, which comes in a whole host of languages. Sometimes I'm embarrassed to be a journalist that goes to conflict zones, because sometimes I think we exacerbate the conflict. I talk about a conflict, and people choose to watch my channel because they believe in the opinion that I'm putting across, and they feel more confident in expressing that opinion. I'd like to finish in the same way I started, with the conflict in Israel and Palestine. It was a story that I did early on in my career, and it was in a hospital ward at Hadassah Hospital in Jerusalem. 2 13-year-old girls in 2 hospital beds next to each other. The one's name is Adi, she's Jewish, and the one's name is Christina, she's Palestinian. Christina had been in a car with her parents and her younger sister, and they'd been driving through Bethlehem. And it just so turned out that the car they were driving was the exact same color and the exact same model of a car that the Israelis were looking for that had a Hamas commander. So they struck the car. And Christina's younger sister fell to the ground and was killed. And Christina was in hospital. Adi had gone out for a night with her friends in Jerusalem at Pizza Hut to have a pizza. And a suicide bomber had blown herself up, but not just blown herself up, she had a suicide belt that had scraps of metal that would make the injuries that much more severe. And Adi had already had something like 15 operations, and she still couldn't walk, and she was still using crutches. And these were the real victims of a conflict that was beyond them. A Jewish girl, an Arab girl, side by side in a hospital room. And a couple of years later, I got a message on Facebook from Christina. And she said to me, I remember you. You're that nice journalist that came and interviewed me when I was in hospital. I hate it when people tell me I'm nice because, sometimes I go somewhere and people say, you're so nice, come back and visit. And I always think, you don't want me to come back and visit because the only reason I would visit is because there's a war in your country. Anyway, she sends me this Facebook message, you're so nice, you're that journalist, and because of you, I decided to become a journalist. And in that way, I think, through stories and through believing and through passion, we can touch the hearts of people, and I think we can make a difference. So despite the conflicts, there are pearls of beauty in every war that there is. And I want to end with one more note. In September last year, Israel and Bahrain signed a peace treaty. And because I live in Israel, I want you to know, especially to the Bahraini women who are here, how excited the Israeli women are about that. The fact that politics is separate from friendships, and that we can make real, meaningful dialogue and change as women, even from countries that theoretically were at war, or are at war, or will be at war. But that was a message to bring to you, and the message is Shalom, Salam Alaikum, which means peace be with us. Thank you.